They buried the old world. What remains still exposes their greatest cover-up. The basement went down 6 stories. That hit me before the building above it did. Not the ornate facade. Not the columns. Not the cupola that looks, from the right angle, almost exactly like the kind of structure you find in Constantinople or Cairo or the imperial cities of Mughal India. The basement. 6 stories of subterranean architecture beneath a building that the official record says was constructed in the 1870s by a civic committee in the American Midwest, using local labor from designs produced by a local architect whose previous work consisted of 2 courthouses and a grain warehouse. 6 stories of basement. For a grain warehouse architect. In a city that had been, by the official account, a muddy trading post 40 years earlier. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was looking into the origins of what historians call the American Renaissance, the explosion of neoclassical, Beaux-Arts, and Byzantine-influenced civic architecture that appeared simultaneously across dozens of American cities in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. The question I started with was innocent. Where did the money come from? The question I ended with was different. It was, where did the buildings come from? Not the money, not the architects, not the labor, the buildings themselves. The impossible, over-engineered, globally influenced, structurally sophisticated buildings that appeared in cities that, by every account, should not have been capable of producing them. And once I started pulling that thread, I could not stop. The official story goes like this. After the Civil War, the United States entered a period of extraordinary economic expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. Industrial production accelerated. Urban populations grew rapidly as immigration from Europe brought millions of workers to American cities. The resulting wealth funded an era of civic ambition. City halls, courthouses, libraries, post offices, train stations, universities, and hospitals, built at a scale and sophistication that was meant to announce the arrival of America as a mature civilization. The architectural style of this period drew on European precedents. American architects traveled to Paris, Rome, and Vienna to study at the great academies. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris was particularly influential. It trained a generation of American designers who returned home with European aesthetic vocabularies and applied them to American civic commissions. The result was the gilded grandeur of the late 19th century, ornate, confident, and deliberately referential to the great civilizations of the past. That narrative is real. The École des Beaux-Arts connection is documented. The European travel of American architects is documented. The economic expansion of the Gilded Age is documented. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what the documentation actually shows when you start asking specific questions about specific buildings. Let's start with the numbers. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the White City, was built on a site that, in 1890, was described by the planning committee as a swampy, undeveloped tract of lakefront land. Within 30 months, 200 buildings had been erected across 690 acres, including structures of such architectural sophistication that observers at the time struggled to describe them without invoking ancient Rome or classical Athens. The Administration Building, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, at the time the largest enclosed space in the world, rose from a site that had been, by the official record, essentially empty 3 years earlier. The labor statistics presented at the time claimed a workforce of approximately 40,000 construction workers operating at peak. Modern historians of the exposition have broadly accepted this figure. But the engineering historian Robert Muchigrasso, writing in his 1993 study of the exposition, noted that the construction timeline, cross-referenced against the available labor pool and the documented material supply chain, does not easily compute. The amount of load-bearing plasterite, the composite material used for the building's famous white facades, required to complete the exposition on schedule would have demanded a production and transport operation of industrial scale, for which no contemporaneous records have been found in the railroad freight manifests of 1891 to 1893. Grasso did not pursue the implication of this observation. He noted it in a footnote and moved on. But the footnote stayed with me. Because the absence of freight manifest for the largest construction project in American history up to that point is not a minor archival gap. Freight manifests from this period are among the best preserved industrial records in existence. The railroads kept meticulous records. The major Chicago freight terminals have archives that are substantially intact and have been examined by historians of the Gilded Age in considerable detail. The material for the White City, to the degree it appears in the archive at all, appears already on site, as if it were already there. That's not evidence of anything, necessarily. Archives are incomplete. Records were lost in the Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed vast quantities of the city's documentary history. Maybe the freight records were part of what burned. Maybe they were never properly filed. Maybe the production was so distributed across small suppliers that no central manifest exists. Maybe, but the timeline isn't subtle. Speaking of what was already there, let me tell you about the buildings. In 2017, a researcher named John Levi began publishing a series of video essays and written analyses examining what he described as anomalies in the historical record of 19th-century American civic architecture. Levi is not an academic. His work has not been peer-reviewed. I want to be transparent about that. But the specific observations he made about specific buildings have been independently verified at the level of basic physical and architectural fact, in a way that I think deserves serious attention regardless of the broader framework he applies to them. The observation that recurs most frequently in Levi's work, and in the work of the small community of researchers who have taken up similar questions, concerns foundations. Specifically, the ratio of subterranean to above-ground structure in 19th-century American civic buildings. In conventional 19th-century construction, foundations are sized to support the load of the structure above them with appropriate safety margins. A three-story building requires foundations capable of supporting a three-story building. The basement, if any exists, is typically one story, used for mechanical systems, storage, or service functions. In a significant number of major American civic buildings constructed between 1870 and 1910, the ratio is different. The subterranean structure is disproportionate to the above-ground structure in ways that suggest the foundation was not designed for the building that sits on top of it, but for a building that is substantially larger, heavier, or differently configured. Multiple buildings in this category also show evidence of ground-level windows that are now below grade. Windows that were designed to admit light at a level that is now buried under several feet of fill. This observation, windows below the current ground level, was documented in a 1978 survey of historic commercial buildings in St. Louis conducted by the Missouri State Historic Preservation Office. The survey noted, without particular emphasis, that 14 of the buildings examined showed original window openings that were partially or wholly below the current sidewalk level, suggesting that the street grade had been raised after the buildings were constructed. This is acknowledged in urban history as a known phenomenon. Many American cities raised their street grades in the late 19th century for sanitation and drainage purposes. Chicago famously raised the grade of its entire downtown district in the 1850s and 1860s, lifting existing buildings hydraulically while the new street level was established beneath them. That explanation is real. It is documented. Street grade raising happened. But here's what matters. In Chicago, the street grade raising of the 1850s and 1860s preceded the construction of most of the buildings we're examining. The buildings that show below-grade windows in this context should have been built after the new grade was established, with their windows at the new ground level. The fact that their windows are below the new grade, not the old grade, but the new, raised grade, suggests that some of these buildings were built before the street level that the official record says was established before they were built. The sequence is impossible under the official timeline, unless the buildings are older than they are officially recorded to be. Which brings me to the hypothesis that I spent the most time trying to disprove, and could not. The hypothesis is sometimes called the mud flood theory in online communities that have examined this evidence. It holds that a significant portion of what we identify as 19th century American civic architecture was not, in fact, built in the 19th century. That these buildings existed before, in some versions of the hypothesis, substantially before the official construction dates assigned to them, and that at some point in the relatively recent past, a catastrophic or semi-catastrophic event deposited enough sediment, debris, and fill to bury the lower stories of these buildings, requiring their subsequent excavation and repurposing as the ground floors of what appeared to be newly constructed structures. I want to be clear about the epistemological status of this hypothesis. It is speculative. It lacks direct physical confirmation in the form of the kind of stratigraphic evidence that would be accepted in a standard archaeological context. Its proponents include a significant number of people making claims that range from the plausible to the genuinely unfounded. I am not endorsing the hypothesis. I am examining the evidence that generated it, because that evidence is real even if the hypothesis built on top of it may be wrong. The evidence falls into several categories. The first is the window evidence I've already described. Below-grade windows, below-grade doorways, and below-grade architectural details, cornices, pilasters, decorative friezes that are now partially or wholly buried beneath current street level in cities across the United States and, the researchers note, across Europe and Asia. Photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, held in municipal archives and digitized by historical societies, sometimes show these features in a transitional state, partially buried but still visible, in a way that suggests the burial was occurring during the photographic record rather than preceding it. The second category of evidence is the orphan institutions problem. Let me be fair to the official narrative before I describe it. The rapid proliferation of civic institutions in American cities during the 1870s through 1900s, orphanages, asylums, hospitals, poor farms, and houses of industry, is well documented and well explained by conventional history. The Industrial Revolution created mass poverty. Mass immigration created overcrowded cities. The reform movements of the Progressive Era responded with institutional solutions, build the facilities, staff them with trained administrators, and address social problems at scale. The architecture of these institutions was deliberately imposing, meant to signal civic seriousness, to reassure the public that the problem was being managed. That explanation is real. I hold it as the primary explanation for most of what I'm about to describe. But here is the orphan problem specifically. The number of orphans and foundlings recorded in American institutional records in the 1870s and 1880s is, when examined against the demographic data for the period, statistically anomalous. The foundling hospitals of New York City, primarily the New York Foundling Hospital, established 1869, and the Nursery and Child's Hospital, established 1854, processed tens of thousands of children in the decades following the Civil War. Their intake records, held at the New York Archdiocesan Archives and partially digitized, describe children brought in with no documentation, no family identification, no known origin. Not orphans in the conventional sense of children whose parents had died and could be named. Children for whom there was no prior record at all. This is not unusual for the poorest strata of urban immigrant populations in this period. Undocumented people had undocumented children. The absence of records reflects the absence of institutional connection, not necessarily anything more mysterious. But the part that keeps me up at night is the geographic distribution. The anomalously high foundling populations were not concentrated in the cities that received the highest volumes of immigration: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, though those cities had large foundling populations. They were also anomalously high in cities in the interior of the continent, in regions where the immigration wave had not yet fully penetrated, in cities where the institutional infrastructure to receive and process large numbers of undocumented children appeared, like the civic architecture surrounding it, very suddenly in the 1870s and 1880s. With capital and organizational capacity that the local population did not obviously possess. Where did the children come from? Where did the capital come from? Where did the buildings come from? The official answers to all three questions are versions of the same answer: from the growth, the immigration, and the wealth of the Gilded Age. The growth explains the children. The immigration explains the lack of documentation. The wealth explains the buildings. And within the official framework, those answers are coherent. They are also at the specific level of individual cities and individual institutions, frequently not supported by the surviving records. The records that would ground the official explanation, the financial records of civic building committees, the immigration intake records for specific foundling populations, the construction documentation for specific buildings, are, in a pattern I have now seen repeated across this entire investigation, incomplete, damaged, or missing. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the below-grade windows are entirely explained by street-grade raising, carried out in a piecemeal and poorly documented way across dozens of American cities simultaneously. Maybe the construction documentation for the White City and hundreds of similar projects was lost in fires, floods, and the general archival neglect of the 19th century. Maybe the orphan population anomalies reflect real demographic phenomena that are harder to trace than they should be because the people involved were the least documented people in American society. Maybe every anomaly in this investigation has a mundane explanation that simply requires more archival work to establish. All of those things are possible. Most of them are probably true for most individual cases. But here is the pattern that I cannot explain away. The anomalies cluster in time. The below-grade buildings, the disproportionate foundations, the orphan population spikes, the undocumented civic wealth, and the photographic record of structures appearing in cities that had no documented capacity to build them. All of this concentrates in the same 40-year window, from approximately 1860 to 1900, across the same geographic area, with the same institutional signatures. If these were independent anomalies arising from independent causes, the clustering would be coincidental. If they reflect a single underlying phenomenon, a phenomenon that the official record was constructed in the years immediately following to explain away, then the clustering is the signal. The part that should disturb you most is not the buildings or the foundations or the children without records. It is the photographs. In the period from approximately 1865 to 1895, photographic technology had advanced to the point where it was being used systematically to document American cities. The photographs from this period are among the most carefully studied visual historical records in existence. They show, in cities from San Francisco to Cincinnati to Boston to New Orleans, a specific visual phenomenon that has been noted by architectural historians without, in most cases, being examined for its implications. The photographs show cities in process, streets being filled, buildings being cleared of debris around their lower levels, ground floors being excavated from what appears in the images to be a layer of undifferentiated fill material. The interpretive caption in virtually every collection where such photographs appear describes this process as construction: new buildings going up, new streets being laid out, new infrastructure being installed. But here's what matters. In several sequences of photographs, held in the collections of the Library of Congress, the Chicago History Museum, and the San Francisco Public Library, the visual evidence is ambiguous in a specific and consistent way. The upper portions of buildings visible in these photographs show architectural details, moldings, window surrounds, cornices, decorative stonework that are already aged, already weathered, already showing the patina of exposure to years of weather. While the lower portions of the same buildings, visible as workers clear debris from around them, are being uncovered rather than built. Not constructed, uncovered. The weathering is visible in the images. It is not ambiguous. The upper stories of these buildings look old in photographs that are dated to the period when, according to the official record, the buildings were being newly constructed. That is not what new construction looks like. That is what excavation looks like. The archive still exists. Most of it. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division holds over 14 million images, including the bulk of the surviving 19th century American photographic record. A substantial portion has been digitized and is publicly accessible through the library's online portal. The photographs I described, the excavation sequences, the weathered upper stories, the debris-clearing crews, are findable. They have catalog numbers. They have been there the entire time, described as construction documentation, available to anyone who looks closely enough to notice what the images actually show. The Missouri State Historic Preservation Office survey from 1978 is in the Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City. The Foundling Hospital records are in the New York Archdiocesan Archives on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The Chicago street grade records from the 1850s and 1860s are in the Chicago History Museum archives. The world's Columbian Exposition construction records, such as they are split between the Chicago History Museum and the University of Illinois at Chicago's Special Collections, where the gaps in the freight manifest documentation are visible to anyone who requests the relevant boxes. The buildings are still standing. Many of them. The basement levels are still there, still disproportionate, still showing architectural details that do not match the official construction dates. The windows are still below grade. In cities across the country, in buildings whose official histories describe them as having been constructed after the grade was raised. The evidence is not hidden. It is in plain sight, labeled as something other than what it appears to be, stored in archives that are open to the public, described in survey documents and photographic captions that use the language of construction when the visual and physical record suggests something more like recovery. I don't have answers, only patterns. The pattern says that the world that existed before what we call the 19th century was different from what we were taught. That the cities we think were built during the Gilded Age were, in significant part, built before the Gilded Age, by a civilization whose name we don't know, whose collapse or disappearance we cannot date, and whose physical legacy was systematically repurposed, reattributed, and officially forgotten in the decades that followed. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe every anomaly dissolves under enough archival research. Maybe the basement floors and the below-grade windows and the weathered facades and construction photographs have explanations I haven't found yet. But the buildings are still standing. And they are still 40 feet underground, holding whatever the original architects put in them. We build on top of something. The question is whether we were meant to remember what it was. I don't have answers, only patterns. And the pattern, this time, is buried beneath every city you have ever lived in.